Are you tired of feeling pressured to tip more and more? Well, you're not alone.
When I was younger, like tipping was only really a thing in like sit-down restaurants.
It's hard, man. Money's tight.
What are your thoughts on tipping culture in Canada?
Well, since we don't have it back home, it's really awkward. It's like, what do I tip? Like, what do I do?
Let's take a trip back in time to see how tipping in Canada became such a big deal and what you can do to tip smarter. The history of tipping in Canada. So, tipping in Canada, where did it all begin? Believe it or not, this cash handling ritual kicked off in the early 1900s. It began as a tradition brought over from Europe, where it was a master-servant custom in England. Fast forward to the 1950s and things start getting serious. Tipping wasn't just a nice gesture anymore, it became an expectation. If you dined out, stayed at a hotel, or even took a taxi, you were basically required to throw in some extra cash. By the late 20th century, tipping percentages skyrocketed. What started as a modest token of appreciation quickly turned into a math equation. 15%, 18%, 20%. Suddenly, tipping felt less like a reward and more like a necessary part of life. Tipping in Canada used to be a polite nod, subtle but appreciated. Now it could feel more like a polite mugging. Hand over 20% or else suffer shame and embarrassment for the rest of your life. Tipflation, the rising cost of gratitude. Tipping habits in Canada have shifted significantly, with expectation rising across various services. Here's a snapshot of how tipping trends have evolved and what's considered the norm now. Tipping across professions. Canadians are tipping more often, with 76% tipping hairdressers, 74% tipping bartenders, and 71% tipping food delivery drivers. However, tipping remains less common for hotel housekeepers at 34% and coffee shop workers at 29%. The average tip has climbed from 16% to 20% between 2019 and 2023, reflecting the growing pressure to tip more across a broader range of services. And here are some tipping trends across different services. And I arranged it from most mandatory to tip to least. Tipping has become a social expectation in many places, particularly in restaurants and bars, where the norm has risen upwards to 20% now. Even services that previously saw little to no tipping, like coffee shops and fast food, are seeing a rise due to the convenience of digital payment options. But there are still things like housekeeping where tipping is less prevalent, so it's still selective based on the service. Public opinion, are we really still doing this? Canadians have mixed feelings about tipping these days. While some are on board, many are questioning why we're still doing it. Recent reports shows a growing frustration with tipping culture in Canada. 64% of Canadians report being asked to tip more frequently, and 62% feel pressure to leave higher tips. This tipflation has seen tipping standards rise sharply. In 2016, 43% of Canadians tipped under 15%, but now only 23% do. Meanwhile, the number tipping 20% or more has more than doubled from 8% in 2016 to 21% today. Tip creep is also causing fatigue, with 83% of Canadians saying too many places now ask for tips, but only 13% has felt service has actually improved. As a result, 59% of Canadians now prefer a service-included model with higher wages, which is now the majority of Canadians. Regionally, British Columbia reports the highest level of tip creep at 74% and tipflation at 73%. Also, 73% of Canadians believe the current tipping system allows employers to underpay their employees. Tipping used to be a genuine thank you for great service, but now it feels like just another part of the bill, expected whether the service was good or not. It's almost as routine now as paying GST on a bill. As someone who's once worked as a bartender, I've seen this change up close. These days, it seems like people tip more because they feel like they have to, not because they really want to. And from the other side, many workers start to see tips as a right rather than a reward. It creates kind of a weird dynamic as well, where servers push for extra items to boost the bill, and the interaction can sometimes feel a bit forced, like they're just after your tips. I get it though. I'm not blaming the service workers because they often rely on tips to make ends meet, so it's not their fault that this pressure exists, it's more of the system. But this system can leave everyone feeling a little uneasy. Tipping around the world. Traveling has really opened my eyes to how different tipping cultures are around the globe. Here are some tipping norms from various countries. It's fascinating to me to see how countries like Australia and the UK, which share cultural ties with Canada, have a much more relaxed approach to tipping. In Australia, tipping isn't expected, and in the UK, a service charge is often included, highlighting that good service doesn't have to come with the burden of tipping. Asia generally doesn't expect tipping at all, with countries like Japan even viewing it as rude. I still remember my first trip to Vietnam, which really drove this home. After I left a tip for amazing service, the server ran out after me to return it, showing that tipping isn't customary at all. It really blew my mind coming from Canada, seeing how different these other tipping cultures were. What I found is that service in these no tipping cultures can be just as good, if not better, than in Canada. And it makes the interactions feel more genuine and less transactional. Let's now talk about the dreaded tipping machines, but I would first like to shamelessly ask for a tip, and please like and subscribe to the channel to help feed this starving YouTuber. The rise of the awkward tipping machine. Tipping machines are everywhere now, from coffee shops to food trucks, and they've made tipping more uncomfortable than ever. You order your coffee, swipe your card, and suddenly a screen asks you to tip 15, 20, or even 30%. With the cashier watching, hitting no tip feels like admitting you're cheap.
You don't look good. You look cheap.
Adding unnecessary pressure to what should be a simple transaction. These machines often push for higher tips, turning a personal choice into a public, guilt-driven moment. Here are some tips to defeat the dreaded tipping machines. The first one is to carry cash. Paying with cash avoids the tipping machine altogether. No screen, no pressure. Second tip is to be quick with the button. When using a tipping machine, make your choice quickly. The less time you spend on the screen, the less pressure you feel. Third tip is to set your tipping rule. Decide your tipping amount before you even reach the counter. This way you're not swayed by the higher options on the screen. The last tip is to remember it's optional. Not every situation demands a tip. If the service doesn't merit it, feel free to skip it. The future of tipping in Canada. Where do we go from here? Tipping in Canada is not gonna disappear overnight, but it's definitely evolving. Here's what might be next. Will tip percentages keep rising? Tipping has crept up from 15% to 20% now, and it might keep climbing as costs rise. But people are getting really tired of it. This tipping fatigue could lead more Canadians to push back against these higher expectations. And I feel like we're already seeing that. No tipping models and service included pricing. Some restaurants, like this one in Vancouver, are ditching tips altogether, paying staff higher wages and including costs in menu prices. It's a hassle-free experience that's gaining traction, and it could lead to more places adopting European-style service-included pricing. The impact of technology. Digital tipping screens are making tipping more public and pressured, and this could push more people toward no tipping models, or at least make them more vocal about it. Cultural stubbornness. Despite these changes, tipping is deeply ingrained in Canadian culture. It's seen as a way to reward good service, so it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. We're likely to see a mix of rising tips, more aggressive tipping tech, and some no tipping experiments. What does this mean for you? Well, the future of tipping Canada means navigating both traditional tipping and newer no tipping models, and it's up to you to choose to decide what works best for you. All said, I think the tipping culture and pressure is much too strong for it to reverse overnight. But I do think we'll see a lot more choice in the future, because I always like to think that the consumer ultimately has the power, and if they are really vocal about it, which I feel like we are, it will move in that general direction. And I'm really curious to see what will happen. Managing your finances shouldn't be as confusing as tipping. At Blueprint Financial, we offer clear, straightforward plans with no hidden fees and no social pressure. Check out the link in the description, and if you found this video helpful, how about leaving me a tip by liking and subscribing?